and welcome to week 12. We are almost there. This week, we're going to talk about root cause and presenting harm. So, I think we're getting into some of the work that some of you may be doing in your facilities already. These pieces tend to exist pretty robustly in most large health systems. So, we're finally here. I know we've referenced this a couple times. This is the Swiss cheese model of error prevention. And um, This particular graphic has been floating around for a while. It's very specific to COVID, which I think is obviously very applicable. So I like using this one that talks about COVID. So I'm going to get through that in just a second. Um, the Swiss cheese model of error prevention really is a way to say that to look at systems related errors. So 94% of errors are systems related, according to Deming. And we really strive to balance between blame and accountability. We do not want to blame people for making a mistake. That doesn't get us anywhere. However, we do need to hold people accountable. So when we start to look at different models and we start to look at ways to mitigate error, we want to make sure that we're striking the right balance between blame and accountability. We don't want to blame, but we do want to hold people accountable. So now getting on to our Swiss cheese model here of error prevention. So this one, they refer specifically to the Swiss cheese respiratory pandemic defense. No single intervention is perfect at spreading preventing the spread of the coronavirus. So here, you've got different layers of Swiss cheese lined up. So what this is doing is looking at ways to prevent the spread of COVID. So the first one, physical distancing, stay home. Okay, well, if you can't stay home, wear a mask. And you need to have good hand hygiene and coughing etiquette. You should not touch your face. If it's crowded, limit your time there. Um, Fast and sensitive testing and tracing. So now you can see these darker cheese, these are the personal responsibilities, and here's the shared responsibilities. What are is the government and corporations responsible for? So getting fast and sensitive testing and tracing, ventilation outdoors and air filtration, government messaging and financial support, quarantines and isolations, and finally vaccines. So you can see how in the beginning some virus particles are starting to get through and less and less and less and less. And with all of these different interventions lined up, we're going to prevent it. So that's the idea of the Swiss cheese model. So when you have something that's very high risk, you want to add as many barriers between um, what you're trying to avoid happening, the risk, and the unintended outcome. So the more barriers you have. So what you see this red line here, right, where the little COVID particles are finding their way through. If there's always going to be a way through all these barriers of Swiss cheese. Nothing is foolproof, but the more barriers you have, even though just vaccines is not going to solve the problem, just quarantines is not going to solve the problems, just washing our hand is not going to solve the problems. But when you start to layer all these things together, we get, we get to something that will make sense. So the next thing I want to talk about is a culture of safety and just culture. So your book talks a little bit about the difference between violations, errors, and slips. So a violation, this is something when an employee or a person acts in a way that's in clear violation to protocol. There's some willfulness behind it. There's knowing that they're violating protocol, policy, whatever it is they're violating. That's when you get into a violation. There's some sort of intent typically behind it. Errors are just that. It's a human error. Somebody made a mistake. They should not have behaved that way. A mistake was made. It was a lapse in judgment. They moved too quickly. Whatever it was, it was truly a mistake. That's where we want to really hold people accountable, um, improve the process, but we don't necessarily want to blame people or ruin somebody's career over a mistake. And then slips, this would be what you may call a near miss. This would be something almost happened or is about to happen, and you slip and you catch yourself. So that would be the difference between violations, errors, and slips. Errors and slips are where we can use process. Violations, if you have somebody willfully acting against the known protocol, then you have a whole different set of issues. We're focusing mostly on the errors and the slips. We're not assuming malintent on the part of the employee. So your text then goes on to talk about just culture, which it defines as an atmosphere of trust in which people are encouraged and rewarded for providing patient safety information. Most hospitals these days would call that a culture of safety. Culture of safety is actually promoted by the AHRQ. So I have the website to the Culture of Safety Primer for those of you who are interested. And the Culture of Safety really creates four very specific areas. It's an acknowledgement of the high risk nature of the organization's activities and the determination to achieve consistently safe operations. So in the culture of safety, you say, we know this is a high risk environment. You want to create a blame-free environment where individuals are able to report errors or near misses without fear of being reprimanded or punished. You need to encourage collaboration across ranks and disciplines to seek solutions, and that there's an organizational commitment of resources to address safety concerns. So a culture of safety, many of you may have culture of safety roundings, culture of safety meetings or trainings. I know my organization does them. We definitely do them annually, but we will do refreshers for any group, specifically a group that's had either a high turnover, a near miss event, any reason that we would want to do a culture of safety training, an ad hoc culture of safety training. We can definitely pull that in. And I will tell you, anything and everything that's brought up at these, anything that could be wrapped in a patient safety bucket or wrapped with a patient safety bow, anything that could lead to a perceived patient safety concern would be discussed at these meetings. So typically after an event, so this is how do we get events to get reported? How do we make sure we know about them? That's everything in the culture of safety and the just culture. You really want to get employees to report these issues so that we can talk about them, so that we can fix process that would have caused these errors or potential errors to occur. So we need the information, we need people to report. It's very, very important. Once it gets reported, then we can look at a root cause analysis. You may see it as an RCA. So a root cause analysis is really getting into the details of an issue to figure out why it happened, why it occurred. Was there a gap in the process? What allowed this issue to occur? So in the root cause analysis, you want to know what allowed the error to occur. Was it something, the process break? Did someone deviate from process? Was there new technology that made the process inadequate? What can we do so the error never occurs again? And we want to avoid workarounds. We want to avoid blame, and we want to move to a problem-solving mindset. On page 158 in your text, there's a really great little grid that gives you many different examples, and they talk about how workarounds were put in place, what that workaround is kind of blaming, and how to shift your mindset into a problem-solving mindset. So I'm not going to go through them all now, but I really would recommend, if you haven't read the chapter, to look at page 158, because I think that grid is helpful to understand how we want to shift from just putting a workaround in place to actually getting to more of a problem-solving mindset. And key to that are really the next two bullets, asking why instead of who. We don't necessarily want to know who made the mistake. We want to know, why did the process allow for that mistake to occur? What in that process, what layer of Swiss cheese was missing that allowed this mistake or this error to happen? And in Lean, you're going to hear the word Gemba, and that means go to the place where the problem occurred. So instead of having your RCA perhaps in a boardroom or a conference room, take that walk and go see, go to where it happened. Look at the physical space, because sometimes you'll find out exactly why it was easy for someone to make a mistake. Maybe there's something very distracting. The physical layout is problematic. There's something in the environment of that location that is causing, that would cause that error to occur. So getting into the space is really helpful. And just like management by walking around and doing your rounding, getting onto the floors, going to where things occurred, it is meaningful to the staff, especially if you're in a leadership position. The book also goes on to talk about four different potential causes of errors. One is human error, just simple, people make mistakes. It's human error. You moved too quickly, you didn't pay attention, you overlooked something. All of us make errors and mistakes every single day. Negligence really takes that error and says that you really should have known better. This goes beyond simple human negligence now, or I apologize, simple human error, and takes it to a negligent, that that you were careless, um, and you should have known better. You should have followed policy. So it's a step beyond just simple human error. You've done something a little more egregious. Recklessness, it takes it even a step further, that you were completely careless and you disregarded what was there. There may not have been, I think what's important to know here is that these three, there's really no intent. Um, you may have had a lot of hubris here. You may have been going through things aggressively or too quickly, or you thought you knew everything. Um, and then you went even faster. Maybe you were, I think of kind of like going in your car, right? Human error is um, you didn't come to a full stop at a stop sign. You kind of rolled through it and you bumped the car in front of you, or you got into a minor fender bender. Negligence would be, um, you didn't intend to, but you were maybe on your phone and you rear-ended somebody. Recklessness would be you were on your phone and you were going too fast and you rear-end somebody. Intentional rule violation, that's where the intent comes in. So this is, you knew and you just drove right into the back of a car, right? You knew what you were doing and you intentionally and willfully violated that rule. Um, so here, we certainly do not want to hold, we don't want to let somebody go or attribute blame for a simple mistake. That is nobody's intent. Negligence, recklessness, intentional rule violation, that's where you're going to go up on the progressive disciplinary scale here. So this one is probably, depending on what the situation is, this is probably grounds for termination. And then these would be a little situational dependent. But I think it's important to remember that most of these situations, there's something with the process that allowed this to happen. Um, and most of this falls up here. Very few healthcare providers are going to fall down here into this intentional rule violation. Those, I hopefully, knock on something, right? These folks are going to be few and far between. So what do we do? How do we error-proof our hospitals? So three really good ways to think about it. One, if you can make it impossible to create the error, all the best. And one of the great examples of this is specific connectors, right? So if you have like med gases, a lot of times when they're connected, they will the plugs. They call it connectors here. I think of them as like the plugs have different shapes, so you can't possibly mess that up because they just don't fit. So if you want to make sure someone doesn't plug something into the wrong outlet, make it just won't. It physically, you can't do it. You can't make those. You can't make that connection. So that's a really great one. If you can put some sort of technology or physical barrier so that somebody just can't make that error, that's the best case scenario. Obviously, it's not possible to always put something that hard fast in place. So we want to make it harder to create the error. That's where we get a lot of the "are you sure" pop-ups. So one of the examples it gave was programming a medication and you accidentally double tap a key. So you might want to put in 6 and instead you put in 66. Um, so it would have, you can program your software that if it has certain alerts, it would say, are you sure? Does this seem correct? You may hear about systems with hard stops where a provider has to do a certain thing in a system before it even lets you progress into next screen. So um, finding the sweet spot in software, this is a tricky one because you want to make sure providers have access and can do things quickly and easily. And we also want to create barriers. So again, here's where you may see that "are you sure" pop up. Medication barcode scanning. This is also another really, really efficient way to prevent medication error. So if you're actually scanning the patient's wristband, you scan this, everything that's in the system should help alert them to medication contraindications, would all be built into the system. So if they did grab something by mistake, they scan that in, it's going to alert like, hey, are you sure you wanted to be using, are you sure this is the medication you wanted to grab? Um, and another one, the third one, is make it obvious that an error has occurred. So sterile processing here was used as an example. When sterile processing runs their kits, they have an indicator strip in the kit, and it has to change color. So when that comes out of the STARAD, they can take a look at that. If the strip didn't change, they know there's a problem and they can go start looking for an issue. So what can you do to make it really obvious that an error has occurred? So I think for this one, I think of things like counting post-op, counting for laps, sponges, that sort of thing. So if your count doesn't match, that patient doesn't get closed until we find that sponge. So what are some notes about taking these into your practice? One, shift from blaming the person to reviewing the system. So this was not Rebecca's fault. This was not Katie's fault or Bobby's fault. How did the system allow the error to occur? If there's nothing else you take from this class, I hope that next time you are dealing with an error or a mistake, instead of getting frustrated with that person, you take a step back and you say, how did the system fail and allowed this person to make a mistake? And how can we redesign the system? If you take nothing else from this class, I hope that is the one takeaway that you can remember. Keep asking why to identify the root cause. We looked at the 5 whys a couple weeks ago, so that can be a really good way to keep drilling down. Use the simplest method as you start to look into this, the simplest problem-solving method you have. It's probably going to be a variation of the Plan, Do, Check Act or Plan, Do, Survey Act. So when you're doing your root cause, you're probably going to need to, something's happened. So that's your baseline. You're going to make a plan. You're going to do something. You're going to check it, and then you're going to act on it. So most of that, what you do in quality improvement, process improvement, you're going to be doing a lot of these PDCA cycles. Use proactive methods to identify problems. This is another thing I really recommend. Joint Commission loves it. Your supervisors will love it, I promise you. Ongoing introspective interdepartmental audits. Look at what areas are high risk to you. What are accreditation areas? So looking at what's the Joint Commission going to look at when they come to your hospital? What are areas of high risk? And do an audit. Grab a 5% sample of your patient volume for the month and audit it and look at it and see if you're doing okay. And if it's fine, great, move on to something else. If not, now you've got a start of something where you can put a PDCA cycle into place and you can start making improvements. I promise you, no matter what level of healthcare you are in, if you can do this, you can put something in place that's simple, that is surrounding your area, and you can put a PDCA cycle in place. And I promise you, it'll look great for your supervisors having this data on hand when you're surveyed by whoever accredits where you work, whether it's the Joint Commission or AAAHQ. I promise you they love all of this stuff. So really ongoing introspective interdepartmental audits, I'm a huge fan of them. It's one of those things that helps you keep your house in order before kind of blaming everybody else around you. So it's a really good way for you to start that, and you'd be surprised how fast you're able to build a coalition of people to work with you. So highly, highly recommend. In my prior organization, we actually did 6 of them a year. It was mandated, and we would do tons of audits. So I can't stress that one enough. And the last one, I'm happy your book goes here, but signs are just not always enough. Sometimes that's the solution. Well, we're going to put a sign on this cart. Well, in the heat of the moment, when something's going wrong, is somebody going to read it? We just had an issue at my healthcare system where one of our coolers went down in the operating room where we stored biologics, and we could not get the part due to supply chain issues it was about 5 or 6 weeks that this cooler was going to be down. And so it's happening off hours. It's alarming. And what was on there was this full 6-page policy on what to do when this cooler goes down. And what we found was we went too far by putting the entire policy up on this cooler. Nobody had time to read it in the heat of the moment. They weren't going through line by line. So ultimately what we did was we took that down and put bullets. If this cooler goes down, here's who you call. Here's what you do. We have people who are experts in that policy, but they were not notified because the policy was so cumbersome and it didn't say to call them. So So signs are not always enough, and sometimes I was trying to find an image online, but, I didn't find one, but sometimes you just see these carts where it's, like, 15 different signs, and uh, you can't possibly take all that in, and especially now you put this into a situation where it's a trauma situation or you're in the emergency department, the employee does not have time to sit and read 15 signs. So in the heat of the moment, um, how is your process going to serve your employees, which are ultimately gonna serve your patients? And it's probably not a sign. Um, so give that some thought as well. That is all I have for this week. Everybody is doing amazing. And if you have any other questions, please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. Thank you so much.